There are places in the world that seem not to fit into any known category. Switzerland is one of them. A landlocked country that ranks among the most prosperous on the planet. A place where people take part directly in complex national decisions, yet where almost everything functions with a disconcerting calm. Where the streets are safe, public services are efficient, and still, there is no strong figure controlling everything from above. It's as if Switzerland has found a quiet way to organize itself. No noise, no shouting, no grand promises. And that alone, in such a chaotic world, raises a first unsettling question. How is it possible that something like this actually works? The most surprising thing is that it doesn't seem to work through force, fear, or imposition. It works because people trust. They trust their institutions, they trust their neighbors, and above all, they trust that participation is worthwhile. That trust doesn't come from pretty speeches. It comes from decades of small, well-made decisions, from clear rules, and from a culture that rewards personal responsibility. Here, people don't live waiting for someone to come and save the system. They live by taking care of it every day. And that changes everything. The relationship between citizens and the state shifts from confrontation to cooperation. But that cooperation didn't appear out of nowhere. It's not a gift from geography, nor a cultural miracle. It's the result of a very particular structure that has shaped how power, money, and decision-making flow within the country. To understand why Switzerland is the way it is, we first need to understand where it is, how it is organized, and why its geography itself pushed it toward such a unique model. Switzerland is located in the heart of Europe, yet for centuries it was, in many ways, isolated from the rest of the continent. Surrounded by high mountains, narrow valleys, and difficult passes, it was never an easy place to conquer, dominate, or even cross. That geography didn't just shape the landscape, it shaped the country's character. Instead of becoming a vast, expansive empire, Switzerland turned into a network of small communities, each one learning to survive with what it had, taking care of its surroundings, and solving its own problems. There was never a natural center of power that absorbed everything. There were many small centers that learned to coexist. That fragmented origin is still reflected today in the way the country is organized. Switzerland isn't a uniform block, it's a mosaic. It has 26 cantons, each with a strong identity, its own traditions, and a high degree of autonomy. On top of that, for official languages coexist German, French, Italian, and Romansh, which aren't just cultural curiosities, but signs that this country has always been plural, diverse, and in a way, forced to learn how to live with difference. Here, diversity wasn't a modern ideological choice, it was a practical necessity from the very beginning. And that necessity left a deep mark. In Switzerland, people aren't used to having everything decided from a single place. They grew up in a system where negotiating, voting, agreeing, and respecting common rules aren't exceptions but part of daily life. Geography pushed people toward cooperation, and cooperation evolved into political structure. That's why, to truly understand how Switzerland works, the next step is to look closely at how this mosaic of regions managed to become a stable system without losing its diversity. The Swiss political system wasn't designed to be fast, spectacular, or charismatic. It was designed to be stable. There's no strong leader who concentrates power, nor a single figure who embodies the state above its institutions. The government is made up of a council of 7 members who share executive responsibility, and the presidency rotates among them every year. That constant rotation prevents power from becoming too personalized and reduces the risk of anyone taking ownership of the system. It's a model that may seem cold from the outside but produces something very valuable from within: predictability. But the real uniqueness lies not in who governs, but in who decides. In Switzerland, citizens vote several times a year on concrete issues that directly affect their lives: taxes, energy, healthcare, migration, infrastructure. People don't just vote to elect representatives, they vote to decide. And that profoundly changes the relationship between the population and power. Politics stops being a distant spectacle and becomes a daily responsibility. There's no way to fully delegate. Everyone knows that sooner or later their opinion will have real consequences. That constant participation creates an interesting tension. It forces society to debate difficult topics instead of sweeping them under the rug. Not everyone agrees, not every decision is easy, and not every vote leads to comfortable results. But this process creates something very rare, a society accustomed to disagreeing without falling apart, to losing a vote without feeling that the system is illegitimate, to accepting that living with differences is part of the price of living together. This model doesn't just distribute power, it distributes responsibility. When something doesn't work, there isn't a single clear culprit. Citizens can't simply point at a politician and say, "He failed," because many decisions pass through their own hands. And that collective awareness generates a different kind of social maturity. Fewer shouts, less drama, more pragmatism. People don't look for a savior, they look for an adjustment. And here arises an uncomfortable question. If power is so distributed, if no one truly commands, if everything must be negotiated, how can such a country be so rich, so efficient, and so well organized? To answer that, we need to look not only at how Switzerland is governed, but at what kind of economy is born from a system built on trust, clear rules, and shared responsibility. Wealth in Switzerland doesn't feel like ostentation, it feels like stability. There isn't a constant sense of crisis, urgency, or that the system is always on the verge of collapse. The rules are clear, contracts are respected, and corruption is low. That creates an environment where investing, working, and starting a business isn't a desperate gamble, but a rational decision. Large and small companies can plan for the long term. People can save without fearing their money will lose value, and the state can fund services without suffocating the productive sector. It's not magic, it's predictability. That predictability translates into high numbers, high salaries, high productivity, and one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. But here appears the first real emotional tension. Living in Switzerland is also expensive. Very expensive. Housing, food, transportation, everything costs more than in most countries. And that forces people to make conscious decisions: where to live, how much to work, how much to spend, what is truly worth it. There's no room for impulsive consumption without consequences. Abundance exists, but it isn't light, it comes with responsibility. And yet, for most people, the balance works. Wages compensate for costs, public services reduce uncertainties, and quality of life is felt not only in what people have, but in what they don't fear. They don't fear losing their job overnight without a safety net. They don't fear getting sick and going bankrupt. They don't fear the system collapsing suddenly. And that kind of quiet, constant security becomes one of the deepest forms of wealth. But how does all this translate into real life? What does it feel like to grow, age, and live within this system? Living in Switzerland means living within a system that takes care of the long term. The population is aging, as in many developed countries, but it does so in a relatively secure way, with access to high-quality healthcare, stable pensions, and infrastructure designed to accompany people through every stage of life. There isn't a widespread sense of abandonment in old age, nor an abrupt break between active life and retirement. The society seems designed not only to produce, but to sustain. Health here isn't seen as a luxury, but as a structural right. Hospitals are modern, access is broad, and prevention carries great weight. Life expectancy is high not only because medicine is good, but because the environment encourages healthier habits, walkable cities, nearby nature, less urban stress, and a better balance between work and personal life. It's not a perfect life, but it's one where body and mind have more room to breathe. And that can be felt in the small details, in older people walking alone through the city without fear, in children going to school independently, in families planning their futures with a certain calm. It's a feeling of continuity, of life not being a desperate race, but a process that can be accompanied. Yet this experience isn't lived the same way everywhere in the country. To understand it better, we need to enter its cities and see how urban spaces are organized, how history and modernity coexist in the same landscape. Bern isn't a capital that imposes power, it's a capital that accompanies it. It doesn't have the size or the frantic rhythm of other European capitals, and perhaps because of that, it achieves something rare, being the political center of a country without feeling like a center that absorbs everything. Its streets are quiet, its buildings are old, and its architecture preserves a human scale. Here, politics doesn't live in glass towers or on massive avenues. It lives woven into the city itself, almost blending with the daily life of those who walk through it every day. That closeness creates a curious sensation. Power doesn't seem distant or inaccessible. It's there, visible, yet not dominant. Government buildings coexist with cafes, markets, bookstores, and squares where people simply live their lives. Bern feels more like a city that contains the state than a city dominated by it. And that silently reinforces the idea that institutions exist to serve people, not the other way around. But Bern isn't only politics, it's also memory. Its medieval streets, protected historic center, and unhurried rhythm remind us that this country wasn't born from sudden rupture, but from a slow accumulation of decisions. And from that historical calm, from that almost invisible continuity, Switzerland built its modernity. To see the other face of that modernity, the more dynamic, economic, and cosmopolitan one, we now have to move a few kilometers north toward the city that concentrates much of the country's financial and cultural energy. Zurich is Bern's natural counterpart. Where Bern represents calm and continuity, Zurich embodies movement and projection. It is the largest city in the country, the main financial hub, and one of the places where Switzerland's economic pulse is felt most clearly. Here you'll find major banks, many international companies, top-tier universities, and far more diverse and cosmopolitan population. It's a city that looks outward, connected to the world and open to the constant exchange of ideas, capital, and people. And yet, Zurich doesn't feel chaotic. Public transport works with almost obsessive precision. The streets are clean, public spaces are well cared for, and even though the pace is faster, it remains human. There's no sense that the city devours those who live in it. On the contrary, it feels designed to be efficient without being aggressive. Here, modernity doesn't crush quality of life, it coexists with it. That combination, high technology, global capital, and a controlled environment, raises an interesting question. How could a country cut through mountains, valleys, and natural barriers and still build such precise and functional infrastructure? How does it connect such different regions without breaking its balance? To understand that, we must leave the cities and explore one of Switzerland's most impressive aspects, its relationship with the land and how it traverses it without destroying it. The Alps aren't just a beautiful landscape, they're a real physical barrier. For centuries, they separated regions, cultures, economies, and people. And Switzerland had to make a fundamental choice, either resign itself to that natural fragmentation or learn to cross it intelligently. It chose the latter. The result is a network of roads, tunnels, railways, and mountain passes that not only connect the country, but also sustain it. Here, engineering isn't just technical, it's a form of dialogue with geography. Building in the Alps is no easy task. The climate is extreme, the terrain unstable, the costs enormous, and the margin for error minimal. Every tunnel dug, every bridge built, every railway traced requires years of planning, thousands of workers, and massive investment. But that difficulty also creates something valuable, a culture that doesn't improvise. Nothing is done quickly or impulsively. It's done right or not at all. One of the clearest examples of this mindset is the great railway tunnel that cuts through the heart of the mountains, allowing trains to cross the Alps in minutes instead of hours. It's a project not designed to impress tourists, but to make daily life easier, to transport people, goods, and ideas. It's infrastructure built not for show, but for service. And here a subtle tension appears. The more perfect the infrastructure becomes, the more invisible it gets. People stop noticing it, stop thinking about the effort behind it. But it only takes a glance out the train window to see the rock, the snow, the cliffs, to realize that none of this is natural. It's a human construction, carefully embedded within nature. And precisely because of that, to truly understand Switzerland, we now need to look at that nature itself, not as a backdrop, but as a protagonist. Nature in Switzerland isn't separated from daily life. It's intertwined with it. Crystal clear rivers flow through cities, lakes surround residential neighborhoods, and green valleys begin where the streets end. There's no clear boundary between the urban and the natural. And that creates a very particular feeling, that of living within a landscape, not simply on top of it. Here, the environment isn't something to visit on weekends. It's something that accompanies you every day. That coexistence didn't happen by chance. It was the result of conscious decisions, strict environmental policies, and a culture that values preservation as part of collective well-being. The water is clean because it's protected. The trails exist because they're maintained. The forests remain because they're respected. And when all of that works, something emotionally powerful happens. People reclaim the natural space without destroying it. Swimming in a river after work, walking along an alpine path at sunrise, or sitting silently before a lake stops being a rare privilege and becomes part of life itself. But this harmony also brings a dilemma. The more beautiful a place is, the more people want to see it. And the more people come, the greater the pressure on that delicate balance. This is where beauty begins to turn into responsibility. And to understand how Switzerland manages that tension between preservation and access, we must now look at one of the country's most visible phenomena: mountain tourism. The Swiss mountains attract millions of people every year, not only for skiing, but for the complete experience: the cold, clean air, the silence broken only by the wind, the feeling of smallness before something much greater than oneself. For many visitors, it's a postcard. For those who live there, it's home. And that's where the first tension appears. How can such a fragile landscape be shared without turning it into a theme park? Switzerland has tried to answer that question through regulation, planning, and limits, though not always without conflict. Tourism generates wealth, jobs, and connection with the world, but it also brings noise, real estate pressure, and cultural transformation. Some alpine villages have changed profoundly due to the massive arrival of visitors. And that forces the country to constantly negotiate between preserving what it is and adapting to what comes. That negotiation isn't new. In fact, it's part of a much longer story, one still written in stone, in ancient walls, and in castles that have survived for centuries among the mountains. Although Switzerland is seen today as a modern, efficient, and technologically advanced country, its landscape is full of traces from the past. Medieval castles, ancient walls, stone villages, and streets that haven't changed for centuries remind us that this stability wasn't born yesterday. Each generation inherited a country already well organized and, instead of breaking it apart, adjusted it carefully. History here isn't something celebrated only in museums, it's something you walk through every day. That continuity creates a very particular identity. There isn't an obsession with constantly reinventing oneself, but with preserving what works and correcting what doesn't. And that builds a different relationship with time, less anxiety about the immediate future and more respect for long processes. Yet this inheritance doesn't trap Switzerland in the past. On the contrary, it serves as the foundation for a very specific modern lifestyle, one where comfort, consumption, and success exist, but within clearly defined cultural limits. In Switzerland, luxury doesn't shout, it whispers. It isn't displayed in a flashy or exaggerated way. It's there, yes, in the cars driving down the streets, in the watch shop windows, in certain exclusive neighborhoods, but it's usually wrapped in discretion. Here, wealth doesn't need to be constantly shown off because it isn't tied to immediate social status, but to accumulated stability. And that changes the way success is perceived, not as a visible conquest, but as a quiet condition. However, that calm also has a shadow. The high standard of living means that access to certain spaces is almost exclusively limited to those who can afford it. Expensive housing, costly urban centers, and a market that, while fair, isn't soft. For some, Switzerland is a refuge of safety and order. For others, it's a place difficult to reach, and even harder to inhabit. That tension between inclusion and exclusivity is a real part of the country, though not always openly discussed. And it's precisely within that mix, order and pressure, wealth and limits, beauty and control, that Switzerland reveals its deepest complexity. It's not a paradise, not a utopia, not a perfect model. It's a human construction made up of choices, achievements, and sacrifices. And to close this journey, it's worth asking what this country truly teaches us about how we organize our societies and our own lives. Switzerland isn't a miracle, it's an accumulation. A sum of small decisions repeated over a long period of time, respecting rules, participating in processes, caring for the environment, thinking in the long term. There wasn't a single moment when everything changed. There were many small moments when society chose the harder path, the one that demands responsibility instead of promises. And that leaves us with an uncomfortable lesson. Countries don't transform through heroic gestures, but through collective habits. It also teaches us that freedom doesn't always feel like infinite expansion. Sometimes it feels like conscious limitation, like accepting that not everything can be built, that not everything can be exploited, that not everything can be turned into business. that some things exist to be protected, not used. And that idea clashes with many modern cultures that equate progress with constant growth, even when that growth erodes the very foundation that makes it possible. Perhaps that's why Switzerland provokes both fascination and discomfort at the same time. Because it shows that another way of organizing society is possible, but also that such a way demands trade-offs: less improvisation, less spectacle, fewer shortcuts. More patience, more dialogue, more shared responsibility. And in the end, more tranquility. Not as the absence of problems, but as the presence of meaning. And maybe that deep down is what we're all searching for. Subscribe to the channel and discover more amazing places like this. See you next time.